So here we're on the top of Daf Tzadi Beis. That's where we got up to yesterday. And we're up to Nisei Salpi Bezdin Teitze Mizeh Umizeh, which is 3 lines down from the top. So now what's the case? Bezdin issued a hora bitos, and they were matir something that's awesome. Now, if that Isur is a Chiyuv Kares B'Mezid and Chatos B'Shogeg, and the Tzibur actually followed through with that ruling, so they violated what would normally be Machayev a Chatos B'Shogeg. And now we find out, lo and behold, that there was a mistake in this Horah. So Bezdin has to bring what's called a Par Helim Davar Shel Tzibur as a chatos. The individuals who violated this chiyuv kares, shogeg, does not have to bring a carbon. Normally, a carbon for a yachid, for a chatos, would be a kirsa or a seira, but they are exempt because since the majority of the tzibur violated this isur, therefore the chiyuv carbon now shifts to the tzibur. And in this case, the Bezdin themselves that issued that hora b'tos is obligated to bring a par helem davar shel tzibur. So it's no longer a kizba or a seira, but rather it's a par. And this is based on Vayikra Perek Daled, and the pasuk reads, "V'im kol adas Yisrael yishku v'nelam davar b'nei hakol v'asu achas mikol mitzvah Hashem shalot te'asenu ve'ashavmo." V'noda chatos asher chatu oleh v'krivu akahol par ben bakar l'chatos. Now, what we're about to embark on is a discussion and analysis of which horos are included in this klal, the general rule of a chiyuv par helim davar shel tzibur. Omar zeira, lesa lemasnisa. Our Mishnah rules that she, having relied on Bezdin and married another man, is exempt from a carbon. The Mishnah says, Nisei Salpi Bezdin, Tura min ha-karban. That Mishnah, our Mishnah, says Iri, is to be rejected. Why? The Tani Bei Midrasha, based on a brisa, the Tani Bei Midrasha that we learned in the Beis Medrash, Horu Bezdin Sheshak'ach Chama Ulevasof Zarcha Einzu Hora Ela B'tos. If Bezdin issued a mistake on something that's discernible, it's obvious to the naked eye. For example, they gave a hora that the sun is already set, and therefore you're allowed to do malacha on Motzei Shabbos. And then they realized that they made a mistake. They thought it was already nightfall, but really the sun was still shining. So it's before Shkias HaChamah. And now the people violated Shabbos. This is not called a hora. This is called a tos b'mitzius. Hora means a mistaken judgment call in terms of the halacha. But if they made a mistake in mitzius, they thought it was after Shkia, when in fact the sun is still shining. They find out that it's a mistake. Then there's no halacha of par helim davar shel tzibur, because par helim davar shel tzibur only applies to hora, which is a verdict and a ruling that it, again, if not for a mistake in the judgment of the halacha, it would be a perfectly fine, reliable ruling. So there's a halachic inconsistency, perhaps, in the ruling. But if they made a mistake with mitzius, that's a whole different story. That's not going to exempt and exonerate the individual who violated Shabbos. Because the tzibur and the bezdin is going to bring the parallel in Dover. No. There's no parallel in Dover the tzibur. And if there's no parallel in Dover the tzibur, then the individuals become chayav in the korban chatas. In other words, it works like this. When there's a halacha parallel in Dover tzibur, what we do is we lift off the shoulders of each individual violator the obligation to bring a chatas, and we sort of push it onto the bezdin. But in a case where the bezdin did not issue a horah because they were mistaken about the reality, and that's not a call to horah, it doesn't even register as a horah, then we go back to square one, and since there's no power to Helen Dovashal Tziva, then every individual violator will have to bring his own korban chatas. Now, according to that brisa, in our Mishnah, that this woman, who's a married woman, gets a psak from the bezdin, then what kind of mistake did the bezdin make? Did they make a mistake in their halachic reasoning? They made a mistake in the mitzias. They assumed that her husband was dead. Well, guess what? Her husband's alive. It's exactly like the case where they thought it was after Shkia, but look, the son is here. And therefore, there could be no chiyuv of bezdin for a tos here. Because a tos has to be generated by a horas bezdin. Bezdin was moro rola hatir, and it turns out that the logic in the shikul adas is incorrect. In that case, the chiyuv shifts from the yachid to the tzibur, to the bezdin. But in a case where bezdin said something that is not the reality, it contradicts the reality, that's not a horah, and that's not a parallel dovashal tzibur. Hence, the yachid who violated the sisur is obligated to bring a korban chatas. So when a husband appears and he's alive, and now we have clarification that Bezdin made a mistake in the mitzias, in the reality, they thought that he had died. So that's not a valid horas Bezdin. And therefore, that's not miseis machmas horah. That's niseis machmas tov. And therefore, she should be chayav korban. So based on this brisa that has established the limits of Har Helim Dovashal Tzibur, we now have to reject our Mishnah, because our Mishnah exempts her from being a korban because she listened and implemented horas bezdin, but this is not called horas bezdin. And the proof is because the brisa establishes that would not generate a korban Har Helim Dovashal Tzibur. In the light of this price, so we come to the opposite conclusion of Mishnah. She's not p'turim in a korban, but rather she's chayeves for korban. That's the opinion of Zeiri. Rav Nachman, disagreeing with Zeiri, Omar Horahi. This is not tos. This is a horah. That's why she is exempt from a carbon, and it's not a contradiction to the Brisa. We can easily reconcile our Mishnah with the Brisa, because the Brisa would also concede that in this case we have a Horah, and that exempts her from a carbon. Now, what kind of Horah is this? This is a toes gum. But the answer is, I think, that the Bezdin, relied on two Eidim. And these are two Eidim Ksherim. That's not a toes. They did exactly what they were meant to do. Omar of Nachman Teda, I'm going to prove to you that this psak is actually a Horas Bezdin. So wait a second. I made a big mistake here, and I apologize for this. We're talking about our mission of Niseis al Pi Bezdin. Niseis al Pi Bezdin is not the case where there are two eggs. It's the case where there's one egg. Teda Daorahi, the Bechol Tarkula ein echad lo mehem, ve'achacha mehem. In this particular case of Ashes Ish, and a husband is unaccounted for, the Torah says rely on the testimony of one aide, probably with Daiku Minsaba, that she checks it out. So what does it mean that in Kol HaTorah we don't rely on one aid, but in this context of Ashes Isha Holach Bailon, we're going to establish based on one aid that her husband's dead and we allow her to get married, that becomes a valid Horah in which we rely on one witness. It must be that it's Horah. Otherwise, how can the aidus of one aid be meaningful to be matir the Isha? It's got to be because it's Horah. So we're relying on Bezdin to accept the witness of one aid and to be matir her to get married. And that's because the Bezdin's decision is registered as a bona fide Horah. Bezdin says we can rely on the testimony of this one witness, plus Daiku Mitzvah. And now Bezdin comes up with a brand new Horah that with this flimsy, second-rate evidence, we can allow her to get married. Now, what are we going to say? What is Bezdin going to say when the husband shows up alive and well, on 2 feet? Are they going to say we made a mistake? Or are they going to say that she was guilty of not living up to her, we call it due diligence of Daiko Mitzvah? And if we shift the blame from Bezdin to her, it's no longer toes. Because Bezdin assumed that she had done her research, and in fact, she didn't. He writes, Bezdin Amru she'efshal lismoch al eid echad kevin shesamchu ala isha shelo tinasei kodem shetivdog heitev im achein baila mes ulam Shabaila Chazar Nisbarer Shehem To Bahora Asa. Sheisha Zu Lo Bodka Hete Mikol Shenises. Nimsa Shenisuin Ashniim Hayumachmas Hora Mute Shal Bezdin. Below Machmas Edus Hayerecha. So how do you fit this into the language? It says, my timer, lav mishundo roy. So let's see if we can summarize this Gemara. We start with the sheet of Ze'iri. Ze'iri classifies our case as a tos b'mitzius, and therefore ein zu hora. Just like if Bezdin would paskin that the sun is set when the sun didn't set, that's called hora b'tos. So to here, in our Mishnah, when Bezdin has only one aid, and Bezdin says he can rely on the testimony of one aid, so that's called a tos. So says the Iri. Therefore, she would have to bring a korban. Rav Nachman says, no, this is not a tos b'mitzius. There was no fact on the ground, no scientific evidence that they were mistaken about. There was no halachic. I'm sorry, there was no mitzius of tos. So Ze'iri, from his part, he wants to nullify the Chal Hashem Ra. And Rav Nachman says, no, it's a Ra, but a tos. If it's a Ra and tos, then Bezdin has to, has to bear the brunt of the guilt for a Hora and tos. So what is the machlokis now between Ze'iri and Rav Nachman? I'm trying to get down to brass tacks. So Bezdin relied that she would do a bedika, and she didn't do a bedika, or not, at least not a proper bedika. According to Ze'iri, this is like a tos mitzius. How can you issue a verdict that the Baal is dead when in fact it turns out he's alive? It's exactly parallel to the case of Shkias Achama. Comes along Rav Nachman. He says no. This is a judgment. They made a mistake in a judgment. A mistake in a judgment call is still called a hora. Catch exactly what looks. Ziri says it's not a hora, and Nachman says it's hora b'tos. The Iri compares it to hora b'mitzius, opposed to mitzius. So it means, let's start with Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is a bigger chiddush, but I think maybe I can make sense out of Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is saying that just like a halachic miscalculation makes Beis Din guilty, so to speak, on a shogeg level, they could have analyzed the halacha more precisely. They could have been more meticulous about their birur halacha, to clarify what the din is. So that's clearly a chiyuv har helen dovashos. And based on their analysis of the halacha, they gave a hora b'tos. B'tos is that they should have weighed the halacha more carefully. They should have looked at it with a magnifying glass. It was a mistake in the halacha, in their understanding of the halacha. Here too, in the hora of Beis Din to allow her to get married with 8 effort testifying, they made a mistake of judgment. They were assuming that she had done whatever she could and clarified that her husband died. They, the Beis Din, made a mistake to rely on that assumption. Just like in halacha, if you make a mistake in halacha, you relied on a certain assumption, and for that you're going to bring a karban har helen dovashal tzibur. So too here, they relied on the fact that she would make all the investigations. And there was a mistake in judgment. They judged her, lekafspus, that she made a proper investigation. They were relying on her. That's called a hora b'tos. Now, it's true, we can't deny Zeiri's point that the mistake is in Metzius, because their ruling contradicts the reality. The reality is that he's alive, not the way they rule that he's dead. And that gives Zeiri the push to say that this is a hora b'tos that never gets off the ground. You can't recognize it and validate it as a hora. It contradicts the reality. Or Rav Nachman says that it's not the reality that caused the mistake, meaning the lack of, let's clarify if the sun is below the horizon or not. But the source of the error, of the mistake that they made, is by relying on her. That's not a mistake in the reality. It's true that their final verdict in which they, written down on the document that they issued, the husband is dead when in fact he's alive. So that is a Metzius problem. But if you ask me what caused that Metzius problem, it's a judgment call that they were mistaken about. They judged her in one way and considered her to be reliable. And she didn't do the proper investigation.
She's still subject to public command. As
right, Teitze Bizel, we said.
So I mean, when they
but she doesn't bring a carbon. We try to figure out why she doesn't have to bring a carbon. And the only possible answer, and that seems to be unanimously accepted, is that they made it Thomas. And that shifts the responsibility in Hilchos Karbanos over to the Bezdin, and it relieves the individual of that obligation. But that's not true, points out Ziri, in the case where they made a mistake in Metzius. That's exactly what happened here. They issued a ruling. Bezdin said he died. Go ahead and get married. He did not die. Ziri says in that case, we don't apply the principle of Har Helam Davashal Tzibur. Har Helam Davashal Tzibur is limited, restricted to a case of a mistake in Shikol Adas, a mistake which doesn't undermine the Horah. The Horah per se is meaningful. But they came up with the wrong halachic conclusions. But if the Horah is meaningless, read the Horah. The Horah says at 4 p.m. today, the sun set. That's not true. That can't qualify as Horah. And paradoxically, that's going to alleviate Bezdin of the obligation to bring a Par Helam Davashal Tzibur because there ain't no Horah. And Ziri says, look at the Horah that they issued to this woman, that her husband died. That's not true. You can't call that Horah. And if we don't recognize that Horah, it doesn't generate a Par Helam Davashal Tzibur, which B'meila shifts the Chiyuv Karban back to her. And the Mishnah says she doesn't bring a Karban because she relied on Bezdin. Comes along Rav Nachman, he says, no, this is a judgment call. The mistake that they made is because they judged her fairly as a reliable source of fulfilling her obligation that was incumbent upon her to check out and investigate until she absolutely was certain that her husband died. So they were relying on that. That's a mistake similar to a mistake in halachic consideration where they misjudged the halach and came to the wrong conclusion. So on the one hand, Rav Nachman can't deny that this Horah contradicts the reality. But he says that doesn't automatically, ipso facto, remove the Par Helam Davashal Tzibur. To remove the Par Helam Davashal Tzibur, you have to come to the conclusion that's Horah B'Tos. This is a mistake within the framework of the judgment that Bezdin has to make. See, I'm wondering out loud, what would be in a case where two witnesses came in, and as it turns out, they were perjured. They were lying through their teeth, but they fooled the Bezdin. They did a great job. There's a ruling here which is based on a tolos b'mitzius, meaning their ruling is going to be based on what the Eidim told them and they believed. They bought it, sing a hook cycle. And now they issued a Horah which is against reality. But on the other hand, the tolos was that they judged these witnesses fairly, relying upon them. They wear tzitzis, when in fact they were not reliable. That's a judgment. The Erie would say in such a case, there's no Par Helam Davashal Tzibur because their Horah contradicts the reality. The Eidim bluffed them through the teeth, and it just ain't so. Imagine Bezdin, based on two Eidim, are going to condemn a person as a murderer, and then the so-called victim walks into Besdin. He's alive and well. See, Iri's going to yell and scream. That's not Parahel but that's not Horah. There's no Horah here. The Horah is against the reality. They made a mistake in the reality. They said that Reuben killed Shimon when in fact Shimon's alive. And I think that Rav Nachman would say that is a case of Paradar Elam Dov Shel Tzibur. Because if you go back to the root of the mistake, the cause of the error, it's a judgment call. They relied on two witnesses. They checked them out. They thought they were okay. They passed all the trishus and chakiras. They didn't find them to be zomimim. That's a judgment. The fact that these two did such a great job. And what's the word? They goofed them? No, that is a different word. They duped them. They duped the Bezdin into believing that they're telling the truth. Maybe they went to what's it called, drama school, and they learned how to be actors on the stage. That's the best I can do at this point in terms of trying to figure out where they're coming from. Now let's go over the raya of Rav Nachman Teda, the Horahi. I'm going to prove to you that when Bezdin issued a heter, a license for this woman to get married because they relied on A plus B, it's a Horah. If a kol Torah kulei echad lo mehem, v'hacha behem, my time allow mishum the Horah. Why? Because in reality, Isha Zulo Bodka. That's why I think the judgment call was mistaken in terms of their reliability, their reliance on her. Nimtza Shenisu Ea Ashniyim Ayamachmas Hora Hamutes Shel Bezdin Velo Machmas Edus Hayrecha. Now, the next Gemara, which maybe we'll do tomorrow, Omar Rava Teda, Rava is now going to bring a proof to support Ze'iri, and that this Horah is a Horah B'tos. And I think what Rava is saying here is that the Torah doesn't allow you to prove in a case of erva based on the evidence of one witness. So it means that there's no ample evidence on the table. That makes it into a Horah B'tos. Follow? Meaning, what could make a Horah into a Horah in a case of Eid Echad? The only possible element that could validate a Horah in the case of Eid Echad is Daiku Mitzvah, but there was no Daiku Mitzvah, so they should have had A plus B. They didn't have B. That's a total. That's like Bezdin telling us that it's no longer Shabbos without actually, going out there into the fields and making sure that the sun was below the horizon. That's a toast. But we didn't get clarity. What's the opposite of a toast? The opposite of a toast that generates Horah is, I think, a mistaken shikul hadas, meaning they did what they could, but they were mistaken. That's a Horah. All right, we'll stop here, and Beli Neder will try to pick this up tomorrow. and figure this out. I mean, this is a profound sugya that we sort of fell into. Okay, have a great day.